Hello, welcome to the instructions for Module 9. The topic for Module 9 will be Introduction to Hypothesis Testing. We are now beginning Unit 3. Before I go into the content of this module, I'd like to reflect back a little bit on what we have covered in Unit 1 and Unit 2. So remember, we started this course trying to examine how we could collect samples that could represent what's going on in the population. And then as we approached Unit 2, we looked at ideas like probability, meaning how likely is an event to occur. Now we're going to apply that logic to Unit 3, and we'll begin this by exploring the general concept of hypothesis testing. As usual, you need to complete your Canvas assignments located in the module by the due dates. For this particular module, these assignments include your video response, discussion board and peer responses, and you'll finish up the module by completing your quiz. The quiz will cover hypothesis testing. We also saw in our previous unit the idea of z-scores, and I'm sure that construct was new to you. Some of you may have had some experience with hypothesis testing throughout your regular K-12 education, where maybe you set up science experiments and you formed a hypothesis, and then you went out and tried to provide support for that hypothesis. Well, hypothesis testing is an extension of that we use in psychology and in statistics to try to examine what's going on in our sample and really make generalizations to the population. The basics of hypothesis testing has 4 steps. Each statistical inference procedure that we look at from here on out is going to use those same 4 steps. It's really important for us to get those down so that as we add on to our ability to use statistical tools, we're just reinforcing the same steps that we saw here in this chapter. I suggest that if you start to feel lost in the modules that are coming after Module 9, go ahead and come on back to this chapter and even to this video and review it so that you have a good foundation in setting up hypothesis testing. When we look at the 4 steps in hypothesis testing, we'll start off by setting up our hypotheses. In psychology and statistics, we set up 2 hypotheses, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And our statistical tests are going to examine whether or not we can accept or reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the basis of statistics, and it really is saying that there is no effect or there is no difference between the sample and the population. Once we set up our null hypothesis and our alternative hypothesis, then we will look for what we call critical values. And these critical values are going to be dependent on what type of statistical analysis we're conducting. If we're conducting a t-test, and we'll get into that shortly, then we'll use a t-table to find critical values. If we're conducting an ANOVA or linear regression, then we'll use the f-table. Don't worry if that sounds new to you, because we'll be going over it in greater detail in later chapters. Once we establish our critical values, which are based on a normal distribution, then we can conduct our statistical analysis and compare the statistic value that we get to that critical value. And if our value exceeds the critical value, then we can reject the null hypothesis. I'd like you to pay particular attention to the 4 steps of conducting hypothesis testing, and we will apply those to specific examples. One particular example that I'd like you to focus on for this chapter is the idea of popcorn being sold at movie theaters. I've developed this example throughout the assignments, and you can read about it in your module. It really is a realistic example of how we can begin our discussion of hypothesis testing. So go ahead and look for that example and complete those assignments. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will see you back in the next video for this course.